Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll be talking today about making the most of your beer and food tastings. I'm Laura Lodge, and I know from the spring of doing this with Andrew and from his reminders today that we need to get a little bit of a slower start to let everybody kind of catch up and chime in. So what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about some of the fun things that I've done in the world of tastings and how I got here. And by the time we get through with that, everybody should be able to be dialed in. I am a person who joined the craft beer world through the distribution tier. So unlike many who have started in sales or on the brewery side, I started in the middle. And I learned a lot through that process. One of the coolest things that happened while I was working with my brother on the distribution side was that I organized a trade show, and that's normal for distributors, but I organized this trade show to be open to the public. And it was Bill's idea, but I'm the one who set up the tables and communicated and connected with everybody. So 20 years later, the Big Beers, Belgians, and Barley Wines Festival is still going. So that's the biggest tasting that I am part of, and I'm part of that every year. We just celebrated 20 years. My first on-premise retail account that I managed or created was at the Vail Cascade Resort. And that's another element or component of what I do now is I help resorts create their own craft beer program. So everything's soup to nuts in terms of, choosing all of the beers for your list, organizing the list, figuring out the inventory, training the staff, working with your sales reps and your purchasing team, and doing an awful lot of working with the marketing and sales people, which doesn't seem really intuitive, but you kind of have to convince them that the craft beer program is worthwhile. And of course, the critical component of the culinary team. So Vail Cascade that job was the best job I probably have ever had. If I had a bad day, I could go hide in the beer closet. I've also done craft beer programs and also custom beer dinners for Gateway Canyons, which is just south of Grand Junction in Colorado. And then Beaver Run, which is where we host the Big Beers Festival. I didn't have to create or wasn't asked to create their beer program, but their beer program needed to be formalized. And so setting up pairings, organizing menus, and then we did a lot of tastings weekly with each one of our brewery reps to kind of share their beers and grow their brand, but also to kind of incent the guests at the resort to head down to the bar to look at the new craft beer program. The logos that you're seeing on the screen now below Beaver Run is Craft Beer and Brewing. You might know them for the magazine more than for their events. I've done some really cool things with them. The Brewers Retreat is a really neat concept that I helped and worked with on some of the events, not all of them. But it's the whole idea of going to a luxury resort and actually brewing with professional brewers every day and enjoying the resort at the same time. That was super cool. And I also recruit the presenters for their new brewery accelerator program for people who are just getting into the beer world on the brewery side. The logo in the middle on the bottom there of your screen is the Brush Creek Ranch logo. That's in Wyoming. And I did a 5-course or 6-course pairing dinner there. For one of the groups, I did a dinner for at Gateway Canyon. Super nice people. And then in the middle of your screen is Birds of Prey. That's the World Beer Cup downhill races, ski races that happen after Thanksgiving every year. And I think this was our 4th or 5th year last December. We do a beer tasting on Saturday. And you'll hear a little bit more about that one too. But all of these, plus a lot of like welcome reception beer stations, the Bonfire Brewing Company in Eagle has a ladies group called the Hop Flowers. And once or twice a year, I'll go down and we'll choose a topic, IPAs, sours, the world of cheese. We've done some really wacky like Halloween candy, and then just talked about beer and food and done a really nice tasting that's fun with them too. Big formal dessert pairing I did once for a corporate group that was super fun. So you could say that Customized Craft Beer Programs, which is the name of my umbrella business, is really about how to fit a program to the client and what it is they need, because everybody's so different. Okay, so we're kind of 5 minutes in. I think Andrew said that was a good amount of time. So for those of you who are just joining us, I'm Laura Lodge, and I'm going to talk to you today about making the most of your beer and food tastings. This is a strange world, as we all know. And so a lot of what we talk about today, I want to make sure we consider the virtual version as well as the in-person version. So moving forward, just to kind of recap what we're going to cover today, a little bit of general housekeeping before we dive in. Then we'll talk about different kinds of tastings, different location options, whether you're going to choose to serve food or not, how to be super thoughtful when you're doing your tastings, how much is too much, whether you should include education or not, and how. A little bit of the magic fairy dust, and there is definitely magic fairy dust with some of these. Marketing your tasting, documenting your events, all of that is that ever so important marketing PR part of things. Documenting your events, and then customer feedback and following through and following up and stretching that tasting. So in the housekeeping department, questions and answers I can see on StreamYard, I think. And so we're going to give that a go. I'll try to watch that as we go. And if there's something I can address at the time that we're on that topic, I'll do it. Otherwise, I'll wait till the end. And if you would like a copy of this slideshow when we get all done, you're welcome to it. Just email me at Laura@Customized Craft Beer Programs, or you can message me on Facebook. I can tell you, though, that emailing is much more effective. I'm not super savvy in terms of the whole technology world. So this is my first slide. So everything is going to have a fun picture in between. This is what I want everybody to feel like when they're done with your tasting. This was taken at Big Beers at the calibration dinner at the end. It was a Avery Dogfish Head dinner in Breckenridge. And I just think this is such a super awesome reward that somebody is celebrating what they've experienced with you to this degree. Super cool. All right, so diving in. What kind of tasting are you planning? Informal, and by informal, I mean at home or kind of on the fly, just not really planned, something that is happening organically. So on the fly at the brewery or brew pub or restaurant could include something like ordering a beer and ending up with a small plate as well, or being given something by the bartender or suggested by the waitstaff, those kinds of things. Fun and educational. I personally think every single tasting should be fun and educational. It's what it's about. And I think that that's really where you need to get to. So to be mindful of that, I think is important. Promotional, for me, that kind of is, let's show you what our chef can do, or let's show you what our team can do. It doesn't speak so much to me about the brewery as it does about everything else that's happening around it. But the get to know the brewery and the intro, that's more specifically to the brewery and to the beers. We do a lot of that when we do those tastings, like at Beaver Run or at Gateway, where you have a brewery representative, not necessarily the brewmaster, that's there to sample you on their beers and talk to you about their beers, just to give you a little idea of kind of that level of quality, the level of creativity, and kind of hook and connect with the customer. The formal guided tasting with the brewer, those are really cool when you have a brewer or brewmaster to be able to walk through things, because you can then get more technical and you can really connect with the audience in the way of actually cleaning tanks, actually talking about infections in the beer and the realities of brewing and the art and the craft that it takes to make all this happen. Get to know your palate is kind of, I'm using that to mean the kind of tasting that isn't necessarily about a specific beer or brewery. It's something that's different in terms of exploring your senses. And like, for example, I do these for corporate gatherings. If they need a breakout option or if they need an activity option, this is something that they could do to learn and explore that's educational, that's fun, but it's not really about a particular brewery, and it's not about a particular, not super technical. And then, as I said, with all of these, let's keep in mind, we can do this virtually. So the question is how? And as Julie said yesterday, it's not really about getting outside the box. It's about building a new one. So let's kind of keep that in mind. I've seen a lot of virtual tastings happening, a lot of different creative things happening, shipping the beer, building your accounts by telling people where to buy the beer that's going to be in your tasting that day, doing new rollouts we've suggested, and I'm sure people are rolling out beers that way. Go find this beer and let's taste and celebrate together. So let's keep in mind what you can do virtually as well. Your photo for this category, this is the back of the room at Big Beers for the experimental brewing. This is the biggest room and the biggest tasting we have short of our commercial tasting. And this is at 9:30 in the morning. So everything you see there is breakfast beers. But it's super fun and definitely educational. And we have a whole staff that serves throughout this event. It's 2 hours. You need 2 hours for all those beers. Okay, so where are you holding the tasting? This is something you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about what is the attitude? What kind of impression do you want people to have? If you're at your house and you want to do something super cool and special, you might be a little bit more formal. But at the same time, if you think people would be intimidated, maybe it's a little more informal. Non-brewery and restaurant locations can be anywhere in that spectrum of formal to informal. Maybe you have a tasting mat, maybe you don't. Maybe you have nice glassware, maybe you don't. Who knows? And on some level, who cares? You're doing the exercise and having fun with it. It's just good to kind of think of all the things you could do if you choose to do that. Brewery tap room. So you're getting a little bit more formal with your location in terms of being in the space that would normally be associated with doing something that's a little bit more specifically targeted to the experience. With flights informally, thinking one of the things we used to do at the Vail Cascade was when somebody ordered a flight, we would suggest a charcuterie board or a cheese board or a couple of different small plates that we knew paired well with a couple of different or with all of the different beer options on the flight. Another thing about flights that's super cool is that everybody, whether they share them or not, when they finish their flight, they generally pick one of the beers that they tasted in the flight to be their favorite and then buy a pint. So when they buy the pint, that's the opportunity for the bartender or the service staff to say, hey, that pairs really well with this small plate on our menu or with this entree. So that there's an opportunity for a tasting to happen informally that way. In a private space with a small group, you're starting to feel a little bit more formal, like maybe there's some formal marketing that goes with that. Maybe there's formal signage on the room. Maybe there's a formal setup in the room that feels a little bit more official, a little bit more educational, even though education can happen in any informal setting as well. Taking over the whole tap room, now you're definitely talking about an event. That doesn't make it less of a tasting, but it does make it a little bit more formal with a little bit more of an expectation level. And in the brewery, can be more fun and more informal, but it can also be super technical. So kind of depending on what you want your tasting to be. If you're in the brew pub and restaurant, again, you can do, with the purchase of the beer informally, but we also did the reverse, that if somebody ordered a specific menu item, then our servers were savvy enough to say, what about pairing that with this beer? So that there was a reverse experience and another opportunity to offer a tasting as part of our craft beer program. One of the favorites was dessert. If somebody ordered a scoop of ice cream, then the go-to for all of the staff was to suggest Lindemann's Framboise as something that wasn't super beery, but a super cool experience and turns ice cream into a creamsicle every time. So virtual or actual, that's, again, we're talking to what kind of supplies and what kind of materials and what kind of beers do you want people to have for your virtual tasting? How do you get that to them? There's tons of ways to get them, say, tasting sheet, tasting mat. You can do that a whole bunch of different ways. How do you get them the beers? How do you tell them where to get the beers? All of that kind of stuff. How do you help to guide them with their glassware? How do you help the tasting unfold? So your photo for this one, super cool. We were in Maine. This is a brewer's retreat. And this was one of the seminars outdoors at Spruce Point Inn. That's a really awesome, amazing place to go if you're in Maine. Are you planning to include food? Big component for tastings for me. If not, I think you should consider it, and I think you should consider it for a number of reasons. First, liability. Second, focus. And we'll continue, those topics will keep coming up. But when you're including food, you don't have to do anything specific. You can do snacks. Certainly, you see snacks like snack mix on the counter and on the bar in a lot of different places or on the tables. That's also, salty, so people buy more beer. It's also spicy, so people will drink more beer. But you can do snacks creatively as well and do them in a little bit more of a pairing situation. You can do cheese or chocolate to be a little bit more traditional and have a ton of amazing choices there. You could just do targeted foods for a specific effect. For example, Dr. Nicole, when she was talking about spicy foods, she had everybody have wasabi peas. Julia Hers, when she's done tasting, she specifically targets beef jerky or something super hot and spicy that's just a bite. So you can really pick and choose and be specific rather than being generically people-pleasing as well if you're looking to show off a taste interaction or a physiological reaction with your tongue and with the beer. Gourmet foods, you could really go high end. I'm thinking for this, it could be menu items if you're hosting in a restaurant, or it could be literally for, like we do for the big beers dinners, the culinary team has created dishes based on the beers that are being served. So it just really depends on how extensive and high end you want your tastings to be. Super inventive. I highly encourage you to be inventive and fun. One of the things we did for the Birds of Prey tasting is that all the brewers chose a beer that they were showing of the beers that they were showing. They would show 4 or 5 beers and bring a snack. So bring a snack that pairs. So think Oreos, think Halloween candy, think cookies, think donuts, think pineapple upside down cake. There's been all sorts of things that are brought to the table for that, in addition to your traditional cheeses and chocolates. And it's always surprising to people to see that some of the things they have in their everyday lives can be paired with beer. So being creative and being creative on a budget are certainly on the table and are certainly tasty ways to get things done. So don't rule those out on any level. So my food slide, Andrew, if you're still watching, here's some of the food porn I was telling you about. The one on the left is a tasting I did at Crazy Mountain Brewing Company. It was following a beer tour or before a beer tour, depending on which half of the group you were. This particular one was for Nestle, for their corporate executive team. And they tasted several beers and paired with different kinds of chocolate. In the middle, you have Vail Brewing Company. We did a cheese pairing, and there's a local cheese shop. And I went into Vail Brewing and said, "What's going to be on draft on the day that we had this tasting?" And took the descriptions of the beers and some beers into the local cheese shop, and they set me up with several different cheeses to show off. So we talked about intensity, sweetness, aroma, all of the different things you could talk about with cheese in addition to talking about beer. So that was kind of a double educational zone and super classy. On the right, you have Gateway Canyons, which always tops the classy department. Beautiful spread of charcuterie and cheeses on the board in the middle, wine glasses for our beers, guided tasting mat, super awesome program there at that time. So moving on, the importance of being thoughtful. I cannot emphasize this enough. Think about the order of presentation for your beers. Be mindful of people's palates. Seems like it's super basic, but think about it. So you want to go lightest to heaviest in some way or strategically plan so that the sours don't blow out the palate, so that the big beers don't blow out the palate, so that the delicate flavors are sampled first so they can actually taste them. The order of beers and the number of beers are connected. You don't want to have too many beers because at some point the palate fatigue is a real thing. And more than like 6, I think is probably just not possible for people to get the nuance of. And I know that when we talk about, we'll talk about on the next slide about how to try to control for that. Glassware, think about it. If you have the opportunity to get glassware with a bowl, Clear glassware so you can see the color, bowl for the aromatics. I'm sure every brewmaster on the planet would prefer that because that's the best way to serve their beer, is so that you have the aromatics experience as well. But it's not a deal breaker. If you can't get it, you can't get it. Just think about it. And if it's possible, make it happen. The service order of things, think about if you're serving the beer in between each course, or if you're serving all the beers first and you're serving all the food first. Back to, included in that is temperature. So thinking through that, if you are going to do 6 beers and you serve them all at the beginning of the tasting, the first one might be a little too cold and the last one's going to be too warm. So then you think about, okay, maybe I should serve a couple at a time, or I should serve them one at a time. And that works just fine. But think too about the size of your tasting, number of people, and how long you have. Most tastings have a specific window. They have an hour. They have an hour and a half. They have 30 minutes. So make sure it's doable. Number of ounces served of each. This is kind of a pet peeve because people tend to think that the more beer you serve, the better the value and the better the tasting. Well, just think about the fact that after X number of ounces, everybody's fuzzy. They're getting a little buzzed. The focus level is just not there. The ability to actually discern what's on your palate starts to go away. So I would say number of ounces served of each is probably between 1 and 4. Most tastings that I do are 3 ounces. 1 ounce we do for the commercial tasting for big beers because of the high alcohol content and because there's over 500 beers. So you want to be super cognizant of your client if you are, or your guest, that if you are serving food, make sure there's enough food to go with the beer. And if you're serving, if you're tasting your food with each beer, make sure there's enough food. If you're tasting your beer with each whatever, make sure you have enough beer, but not too much. Make sure you have enough food. But think about the amount of food too. If you want people to stay for dinner, you don't want to fill them up during the tasting either. And organization overall, just try to be super thoughtful about how you have it set up, what the service process is going to be like from the guest's perspective. So if you were sitting in that chair, who's going to get in your way? How is stuff going to appear in front of you? How are you going to, have things cleared out of the way? Is there too much on your table? Is there going to be a glass of water? Is there room for the water? So think about that. Let's move on. Here's your photo for this section. This is Gateway Canyons, and that's Dave Thibodeau from Ska and Truck from Left Hand. And this was a s'mores pairing. So they each served beers paired with s'mores and roasted marshmallows and built their s'mores around the fire. Super awesome tasting. So how much is too much? I think this is so important. So back to palate fatigue. Make sure that you are including food for this reason, and try to think too about foods that you can include that will help the palate fatigue. In addition to water between beers, bread. For our homebrew competition judging, we serve the bread that has the least flavor. So I literally go in and order as tasteless bread as we can find. Rice crackers is another solution. So any of those kinds of things will help you keep that palate going for as long as possible. Focus is a funny one. Almost every tasting that I have done, I have needed to literally use that word to try to bring people back in when they are chatting and visiting and doing their thing, and I need to bring them back in to talk about what we're doing. Focus is great for the first beer. It's great for the second beer. It's okay for the third beer. And then it just kind of goes out the window. So there's a couple different ways you can strategize for that. One is to introduce the beer and the food, let them taste on their own so they can talk and do their thing, and then bring them back. Another way to do it is to introduce all of the beers, all of the food, and then let them do the whole thing on their own, and then bring them back to say, what was your favorite? What flavors did you get? And that works really well, unless you want to talk a lot about beer number 1 and beer number 2, because they often can't, taste bud wise, they can't remember that many beers ago. So sometimes it's good to say, okay, I'm just going to do the first 2 beers. Let's talk about beer number 1 and beer number 2, and then do the next 2 beers. So kind of strategize with the focus, and the guests will laugh with you when you say, okay, guys, you need to focus again. but a lot of them haven't seen each other, or they want to socialize, or they want to talk about their experience. And so the focus part becomes a challenge. Amount of alcohol, again, for liability and for focus reasons, really be cognizant about that. If your tasting is all 15% beers, make sure you have matching food to try to soak that up, especially bread to soak that up, and water. And the amount of food, again, do you want them to stay and eat? If you do, then you don't want to fill them up here. You want to be sure that you are being cognizant of that. Your photo for this is one of my favorite photos. Andy Parker from Avery, Dylan McDonald from Dogfish Head, Walter Becker from Avery. This is the tasting we do for the calibration dinner, which is an Avery Dogfish Head dinner at Big Beers. And that's, I think, 15 beers. And the chefs come in and these guys taste them and all the possible beers for the dinner. The chefs pick the dinner and brainstorm about the foods for the menu, the food items. So it's awesome and it's a great exercise, but it's too much just by definition. And they laugh about it. And I am indeed the designated driver. Okay, moving on to education. Maybe I should check for questions. Yum, I like that. That's a really good observation. Okay, how are you including education? So a number of different ways to do this, and it doesn't have to hit anybody over the head. You can bring some ingredients for people to taste with the beer. If you're doing that, you could literally have 2 beers and some ingredients and talk for an hour. No problem at all. You can talk about the styles. You can talk about the history of the styles. You can talk about the components of the styles. You can talk about characteristics of the styles, just as you go through your tasting. You can talk about the story of the beer, which may or may not actually relate to anything technical. I know one of my favorite stories was a rep who was not necessarily carrying the best portfolio, but he had the best stories. And one of them was that the name of the beer and the story behind the beer was a friend of the brewery that participated in beard competitions. And so the beard had been styled into a pretzel. And so they had named the beer after the beard. So super cool. Another one was the brewmaster didn't want to make this beer again because it was a pain. So he asked his daughter, who was, I think, 3 or 4, what she wanted to name the beer, and she called it Princess Yum Yum. You can trace that back to Denver Beer Company if you want to. And of course, the beer took off, and so Princess Yum Yum became a thing. So really good stories, and that will go home with people. People remember stories. Explanation of the brewing process, especially if you have a brewer that can talk through that with people and explain how it works. Talking about the glassware. Funny story for this one. Somebody said once, how much wine would you sell if you served it in iced tea glasses? The obvious answer is not much. So think about that with your beer too. And they were, of course, talking about a pint glass. So think about what difference the glassware makes. Talk to your customers about the glassware, why it makes a difference, and what components of the glassware are actually making that difference. If you haven't done the Spiegelau comparison between the pint glass and their glassware, it's a good one to do. And even if you can't taste the beer, just the aromatics is sufficient. It's a dramatic difference. The tasting mat, I think, is one of the best components of any tasting. And that's, I guess, the nerd in me. But I like to have people be able to organize their beers in front of them and be able to go back to 1 or 2 and have them organized with the name of the beer so they know what they're going back to and which beer is that beer. Especially that 15 beer tasting that I showed you. If we didn't have tasting mats to line those up and keep those in order, we wouldn't be able to say, taste this Dogfish Head beer with this Avery beer and see if they should go with the same course. Same is true with any tasting. And a lot of people will want to go back to this beer or that beer. And to have them organized and have an ability to take notes is brilliant. And I'll show you a couple of those. Program, if you have a big tasting, you might want to offer some description. The Avery Sourfest has a 1-sheeter, both sides, 1 line of description for each beer. For big beers, we have like a 65-page program with tasting notes on each one. So it really kind of depends. What are you doing? What is that level of expectation? How do you want to bring that tasting level up to a certain degree of expectation for the customer too? The more fine dining, the more white tablecloth we make our beer tasting for big beers, the better people are behaved, the more responsible they are about their drinking. Just think about that in terms of how you're setting the expectations for your event. Make it memorable. So there's a ton of different ways to do that, but giving them something to take home, sorry about the grandfather clock, to give them something to take home is always a good thing. That could be the tasting mat, and people take the tasting mat into the liquor store to buy the beer. That has definitely happened to me many times. Give them some swag, give them some stickers. Is there something that you can do to make it about them and make it take your brand home with them? So here's your photo or photo collage in this case. This is a tasting mat for Gateway to Craft Beer. This is Gateway Canyons, and this was a milk stout comparison. 2 milk stouts from Left Hand and 2 from Ska. You can see ingredients scattered there too. On the top right, that was also Gateway, but that was grain to glass. So it was a distiller and a brewer. And those are the ingredients that Brian from Deschutes brought with him to taste with beers, to talk about, taste and talk and look at the ingredients and then taste the effect that they have in the beer. That was really cool. Tasting mat on the bottom left from Big Beers. I think that was the same beers that you saw in the back of the room tasting from before. 6 beers. This was the bitterness challenge and the perception of IBUs when you're tasting New England IPAs. And the last one on the bottom right, this is from our Beers of Prey. And this is kind of speaking to the fact that when you are doing something like this that's informal, that's walk up to the tent and ask for the beer, people don't always remember, or they're not aware of the fact that there's a pairing. So by putting signage on there and making it a little more formal, you're saying, yes, when you get that Velvet Merlin, you also want to make sure you have chocolate covered espresso beans. And this also highlights the fun of doing those tastings. Lagunitas Brown Sugar is awesome. The caramel macchiato, though, tipped it over the edge. So that's speaking to that creative innovation weirdness that everybody has so much fun with. The magic of effective tasting. So this is my fairy dust slide. I really think that there's so much you can do in logistics, and then it becomes more about this stuff. The environment is key. You want to have a neutral environment. You want to have an environment where there's not a lot of noise. There's not smoke. There's not a lot of food aroma if you can get away with that. You want to really make it neutral and clean. You want to make sure that it's also presented in a neutral way. One of the things that's really worked for me is to start out by explaining that not everyone can actually physically taste every flavor component. Two examples, ginger and hops. So the hop bitterness, it turns out, is not experienceable by everyone. So lining up a whole bunch of people and giving them a scale of 1 to 10 and saying how much hop bitterness is in this beer and serving them all the exact same beer, you'll find that there's an enormous variety of experience. So when you, who are super sensitive to bitterness, are tasting that triple IPA and it's just not palatable, you can't even choke it down, and somebody else picks it up and drinks it and says it's just fine, they may not be able to taste that bitterness at all. And that's something that just doesn't occur to people. There's a big onus on, I need to taste what everybody else is tasting, or I'm not doing it right. So to establish at the beginning of the tasting that not everybody can taste everything is kind of taking that onus off. It's kind of lightening the load and saying what you're tasting is going to be different from everybody else's, and it's okay. Ginger is another one. I've discovered with ginger beers that some people will say, oh, they didn't really add any. And some people will say, I can't taste anything but ginger. So same beer, same can, same bottle. It's just a whole different ballpark. So explaining that is a good thing. Curiosity and opportunity. I think that when you talk about an open forum for people to experience their own palate and get to know their own palate and talk about what they experience rather than what their neighbor is experiencing or what you're experiencing, I think that that is a different approach from, I don't really know much about beer, so I'm just going to say whatever my neighbor says. There is no right or wrong, and to kind of establish that this is an open opportunity and and let people be curious about what they're tasting. Maybe start your tasting with each beer and saying, I want you to taste it first and talk about what you taste. And then let's talk about the style of the beer. And then let's talk about the ingredients in the beer. And then let's talk about the things that you might be tasting. Really celebrating, discovering, and validating what people are experiencing is a huge part of what makes it tasting really over and above awesome. You really are saying, wow, you get that flavor? I haven't thought about that before. Let me go back and taste that. Or let's everybody take a sip and see if you can taste garlic, or if you can taste leather, or if you can taste tobacco in this beer, because it's something that, I haven't heard as a descriptor for this beer again. So let's go back and try. So I think that curiosity and that opportunity and bringing something new really kind of energizes people and frees them to experience what they're personally experiencing without this weirdness going on about, I'm not doing it right. I've also learned that if you talk about a whole bunch of different descriptors of what you might taste, then you're not telling people what to taste. And that seems like a really slight distinction, but it's a really big deal if you've got people who are feeling a little insecure about the process. Saying you might get banana, you might get clove, you might get this, you might get that, you might get orange peel. Then people go back and they say, oh, well, I get this, but I can't find that. And it's okay. There's no judgment because you couldn't find that piece. So if you can take the judgment out and explain why there's no judgment necessary and kind of take the wind out of the sails of anybody who's there to say that they know most and best and they're going to be the palette of choice in the room. If you can level the playground, everybody has a better time. And I find that works out really well. Experiment. Here's another one. This is a big one for me too. I always get people who say, I don't like IPAs or I don't like dark beers. Well, how about coffee? Do you like coffee? Most people do. Well, maybe try that beer and see if you can taste the coffee. The roast usually will get them some coffee. How about chocolate? Do you like chocolate? That will almost always get people past that mental block. It's not always, but almost always. They'll say, oh, well, maybe I'll try it again. Maybe I'll give it a little bit of a try. I don't like hoppy beers. Well, maybe try a New England IPA. Maybe try this Brut IPA. Maybe try, there's different ways to work with that without invalidating their dislike. I understand and believe, and absolutely that's 100% your experience. But let's try another experience and let's work around that. Let's find different ways to be creative with the roadblock that you found previously. And that has been really cool to work with. Another thing and another reason to have food with your tastings is the effect that food can have on the experience. So if you don't like that IPA, try that IPA with this blue cheese, or try this amber with the cheddar, try, whatever. If you didn't like it before, try it with some food and then explain how the food can change the beer and the beer can change the food. So you might have a completely different experience. And there have been so many wow moments over time of, oh my gosh, I now like this thing because it's a whole different ballgame because I added the food. So all of these things can really be that magic and that aha that people will walk out of that tasting, no matter what happened with your timing, no matter what happened with the beer being weird, and say, oh my gosh, that was amazing, because they discovered something and were validated in that discovery and were encouraged in that discovery in your tasting. So my picture for that one is this. And I picked this picture really deliberately. This is Brush Creek Ranch in Wyoming. And this is a group. This is the group I also did a tasting for at Gateway. But I chose this picture in particular because you can see under people's arms on the left side, you can see a Corona and you can see a Stella. And they were open to doing this craft beer dinner pairing. And this particular moment was a really good one for me because it really emphasized know your group, know who you are talking to. And when you do your tastings, if you're doing a tasting for your brewery staff, that's a whole different approach than if you're doing it for your customers. And if you're doing with savvy customers or your mug club versus somebody, a group that's off the street that's visiting as tourists that may never be there again, and you have one shot to make a good impression, that's a whole different attitude. And so for this particular group, I started out like I start many of my presentations by saying there's a time and a place for all different kinds of beer. There's a cold and refreshing time, and there's a time for flavor, like with your dinner and with your, big armchair in front of the fireplace. Well, in this particular case, I said, when you get done mowing the lawn, you want refreshing, you don't want flavor. And the leader of the group looked up at me and he said, we don't mow our lawns. And I thought that was bizarre, but yes, none of these people mow their own lawns. Somebody else mows it for them. So I laughed and I pivoted and I said, okay, how about on the beach? When you're on the beach, you don't want flavor. You want cold and refreshing. So, and we talk about that's the reason the mountains turn blue on the Coors products. So it's really kind of a funny moment. It was an embarrassing moment, but pivot around it and remember that you need to know your audience when you're doing a tasting like this so that you can frame things in a way that's actually relevant to them. Let's see if I have any questions. Just checking back. Oh, a little bit of validation. Thank you. Okay. How are you marketing or announcing your tasting? So a lot of this is just mechanics, but you need to remember all of the options you have with mechanics. So let's also talk about this right now in terms of virtual tastings. Posters and flyers in strategic locations. So if you're doing this virtually, that means on social media, that means on your website, that means in other places in your Facebook ads or however else you're marketing what you're doing. If you're doing the tasting in your brewery, brew pub, restaurant, you want to put those flyers and posters where people can see them. And maybe if you're doing, if I'm doing a tasting with Avery at the hotel, then I want the posters or the announcements to be both at Avery and at the hotel. At Avery or at some, like at the Falling Rock Tap House, some of the most effective ads are on the back of the bathroom door stalls. Where are you going to put those flyers? So think about that too. Where are you going to get people's attention? What is strategic for location? Is it going to be your area liquor store? Are people going in your area liquor store right now? What would be the place to do that? Social media is king right now, whether it's an in-person event or not an in-person event. And remember to create the Facebook event because Facebook seems to be the event place, not Instagram or Twitter. You can brag about them on Instagram and Twitter, but that's not the place to create an event. Networking on other people's websites and social media. So take advantage of that networking piece, the sharing of everything. Make a website announcement, blog about it, put it on everybody's calendar, put it on the community calendar in the local paper, put it on your website calendar, put it on everything. If you have a tasting series, announce the whole series, all of the dates. Make sure that they're all out there at the same time. Certainly talk up each one as it comes closer, but the whole series is good to get on everybody's calendar. And then what did you send home? Remember that your marketing lasts after your event, and keep in mind that you're going to want to send home tasting map, program, swag, stickers. What are you going to take them that's going to help you market the next event? So keep that in mind too. So photo for this particular moment, here's a whole bunch of big beer. So on the left is our poster that we hang in liquor stores. And the reason it's so busy is because our people in liquor stores insist upon being able to see the list of breweries that are going to be present. And we want to show off our sponsors. So that's why that's so crazy with information. But that's our liquor store poster and our brewery poster. Those are stickers in the middle there. At the bottom, that's a homebrew competition certificate. We do a certificate of participation for the homebrew competitions. That may seem like a waste of time and silly until you hear from everybody that they're hanging it in their basement. They're hanging it in their garage. They're showing off this certificate. So that's like permanent marketing for you. Top right, that's a background that we had made for photo ops in the event. So to that point, where in your tasting are you going to, or how in your tasting are you going to give people the opportunity to take selfies or in this day and age, actually put your logo over their picture on their selfie to show that they were there? How are you going to say, I was here? And make sure you brand that. The 20-year reunion poster below, that was one of our signage posters that actually went in front of the room where the tasting was being held. So to that point, if you're doing this in a smaller room or a section of the restaurant or a section of the brewery, announce it. Make a poster, I don't know, 24 by 36 or something. Make a poster that says, this is what's happening in here. So people understand you do this, and maybe they want to come to the next one. Last on the right there is name tags. Why not brand it? Instead of just having a white thing that people stick on their shirt and then tear off and throw away, why don't you brand it? And why don't you make it last a little bit so that marketing goes home with them? So think about that. Little things, but they can be helpful. Are you taking pictures or video? Same stuff, but remember, photo is king right now for all of your social media stuff. And people like to have a testimonial sort of thing. So if they see other people having fun, then they want to come have fun too. So social media, website, blog, photo gallery, wherever you're doing it, put a lot of pictures. And you're using your first tasting, you want to make sure there's somebody dedicated to taking pictures at your first tasting, because you're going to use that as marketing for the next tasting. So make sure you take some creative photos. Okay. So this is a Facebook group that the Craft Beer and Brewing crew created specifically for the Brewers Retreat at Devil's Thumb in 2015. Craft Beer and Brewing is super savvy about this stuff. And I often use them as an example of how to do things well in regard to social media. It's really cool to see the interaction and engagement that they get long after the event. And that's the kind of thing that you want too. You're building an audience. The customer is always right. Well, that's relative. The customer is always important. For customer service and training, the customer is always right and you need to fix them. But in terms of figuring out how you want to run things and what you want to present and the attitude and level at which you want to present it, that's yours, not theirs, but they're the paying customer. And so you want to make sure you validate and solicit their opinion. So actively listening throughout the event. Listen to what they're saying, actively participate with them, connect with them. If there's a time in your tasting where you say, okay, you guys, I'm going to introduce beers number 1 and 2. Let's talk through those. And then you'll have a minute to taste and visit with each other about what you're experiencing. That's also your opportunity to mingle and say, hey, what did you find out? Did you like this? Is this your favorite beer so far? What did you think of the pairing? And actively ask for that feedback and offer validation about their experience. You also want to ask for feedback after the event, in addition to during the event. And you always want to validate or give them credit for their personal opinion, and then ask for input or suggestions about going forward. So you want to make sure that you're expressing to them that you're going to use their experience to help create and tweak and guide your direction going forward. Even if you have zero intent of doing so, you need to let them know that you hear them and you're going to take that into consideration. Take that into consideration is a great phrase. I totally hear you, and we'll take that into consideration when we're planning our next event. Maybe you don't do beans about it, but you heard it and they felt heard and they felt validated. Super important. Any input or suggestions, you can ask for input or suggestions electronically. You can ask for it in person. You can ask for them to send it to you later, or you talk to them in the tap room later. There's lots of different opportunity for that. I've learned that it's good to ask about the pricing and the value. I think that the perception of value is so different often from what I think the value is for something, that it's good to find out where their head is. Did they think that the experience was way more than what they paid for? Did they think it was about right? Or did they think that what was delivered was not enough time, enough beer, enough food? So good to hear and good to adjust accordingly. Maybe not a lot, but to know kind of where your people are. And not everybody's going to be on the same wavelength. So asking multiple people is good. Testimonials are key. Everybody wants that comfort of knowing somebody else had a good time. Somebody else says this is a good choice. Somebody else said this was amazing. So you can solicit testimonials, but you can also pull it off of social media. Just give credit. Usually don't use last names, but use those testimonials to market your next event. If they're good. If they're not, don't use them. Invite trusted people. This is something that I think can be really valuable, especially at a bigger event. If you're not sure that everybody's going to actually give you full feedback, and I've discovered on my own that everybody's so excited to be at Big Beers and everybody's so excited to be at some of these dinners at Gateway or at Brush Creek. They say it was awesome, it was wonderful, it was amazing, phenomenal, fantastic, but it wasn't. You need to have some trusted people that can be straight up with you on that. Yes, maybe they still had a good time, but you need to know what didn't go well. So maybe you comp those people. Maybe not. Maybe it's a discount. Maybe it's just people who would come anyway that you are saying, please, I need your feedback. So it's going to be one of those situations where you want to be sure that you are getting the feedback that you need. Okay, so we're over. So let's go quick. So here's the Big Beer survey that I did in 2020, really asking people for their feedback. Would you come back? What did you do? What did you think about it? So creative ways to stretch it. If you ordered a wheel of Parmesan to pair with XYZ beer, continue, and you have it left over, continue offering that to people at the bar, or continue offering that to people in the restaurant that order that beer. Just bring them out a little plate, a little surprise. Continue offering that on the fly. Continue, if it's a special dish, to say, hey, in addition to the menu, we have this special dish that we have left over from our tasting earlier today. Would you like to try it? Just keep milking it, keep using it as long as you can. Ask for comments on social media if it was amazing. Ask for photos, share photos, have some kind of raffle or something for attendees so you're staying in touch with the attendees. Offer a free tour or a free flight or something that's going to pull them back. You want to stay engaged. You want to keep that engagement going. Hey, we made it. So questions, ideas, or inspirations. I hope that was helpful. I really don't always think about some of these things, and I think they can be super helpful for everyone, whether you're talking about something informal that's maybe virtual, or whether it's something that is really you want a high-end experience and you're just not sure all the things you should consider. I think coming back to some of these points and thinking through them can be super helpful. So I'm here, happy to answer questions. Let me know if you have anything on your mind. Again, if you are interested in having a copy of this deck of slides, I'm happy to provide that. You can reach out to me at Laura, Laura, at customizedcraftbeerprograms.com. If you're interested in distribution information, you can also come find my book. But today the topic is pairings, and that's one of my favorite things that I do. So I'll hang out here a little while longer. I don't know if anybody's still on board with me. All the different variety of tastings that I've done have been super cool to be able to share with you and to really create. So I enjoy that aspect of things. It's more fun than talking about distribution for sure. Do we have any tips on how we can make virtual pairings more interactive? Certainly there's an opportunity to ask for feedback about what people are tasting. So if you're tasting a specific beer, specifically if you're tasting it with food, but even if you're not, you could offer everybody the opportunity to take a sip first and then go around the room, around the virtual room, and ask if there are characteristics or flavors that they find to be unique or specific or primary in their experience. One of the things that I thought would be super cool is to have people on a virtual pairing bring their own food to pair with, have the same beer, but everybody do a different food. And then there's lots of different things for people to talk to and about how their pairing works in this way or that way, but doesn't work in another way. So that's something that could work. I've had people talk about doing virtual pairing dinners where you're all having the same food, the same course, and talking about how well it worked. You could do beer versus wine. I don't know if you're familiar with those dinners, but that's super fun. And then after every course, everybody votes. You could have that same thing happen if you're tasting multiple beers. Have them taste all the beers, and at the end, you're going to vote for the favorite beer or the favorite pairing. in the case of the beer versus wine, after every course, they voted if it was the beer that was the better pairing or the wine that's a better pairing. And you're welcome. Anybody else with questions? I'm glad I could see the questions. I wasn't sure that was going to work well. I still can't see your names. They all say Facebook user, but it's nice to have that question option come through. So anyway, let me know if you'd like the deck. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a great evening. And thank you so much to Andrew for making all of this happen again this fall. It's super cool to have this opportunity, and I appreciate being invited. Take care and have a good night, everybody.